On April 4th, 2023, prosecutors from the state of New York laid more than a dozen charges at the feet of the former president, Donald J. Trump. They weren't the first to come, being merely 34 of the 91 charges the president was to face. Out of sheer probability, no one believed them to be the last. Regardless of whether these were warranted or not, gasoline was thrown atop the raging fire of political discourse. Yet no one bothered to compile the totality of these charges, as well as their implications. In the name of diligence, I'll attempt to do so in 4 videos. One video for one indictment, where all 91 charges will be covered in some form. The organizational scheme of these charges will appear as follows. First, I will discuss the general details of the case. I'll then follow with the specific charges and their backgrounds, and finally I'll wrap it up with the implications. In addition, a disclaimer should be provided. I'm a layman. I'm not a legal expert, nor should this serve as legal advice. I'll be presenting the broad details of each charge at the expense of an intricate depiction of each case. Now, let's get on to the indictment that will be the focus of this first video. The falsification of business records trial in New York. For the sake of protecting your sanity, I'll be condensing the charges into 3 categories. It isn't necessary to go over each one. From an accounting and legal perspective, 1 false entry constitutes 1 false charge. Therefore, each of the 34 charges is tied to 34 allegedly false entries into Trump's business ledgers. Getting into each charge when they are practically identical in nature is just torture. So let's spare ourselves the pain for this case. Before I get into these charges and the accounting implications that drive them, we should brush up on the details surrounding the case. The background behind the 34 charges has to do with the alleged cover-up of consecutive hush money payments totaling $130,000 to Stephanie A. Gregory Clifford, aka Stormy Daniels, and $30,000 to an anonymous doorman working at Trump Tower. Stormy and Trump allegedly engaged in an affair in 2006. Fast forward to 2015, Daniels entered into a legally dubious NDA with Trump, which included the payment of the aforementioned $130,000. These payments were in order to protect his successful 2016 bid for the presidency, essentially buying information to keep it from reaching the wells of discourse. To be clear, his charges are rooted in the criminality of the falsification of business records in the first degree, or New York State Penal Law 175.10. More on that in a bit. NDAs are legal, though, if they are drafted in an appropriate manner. It's also worth noting that Trump originally faced an inquiry by the FEC that he, along with his lawyer Michael Cohen, violated campaign finance laws. This inquiry into Trump's conduct was eventually dismissed, with votes being cast along party lines. During early reports, the Federal Election Committee stated,
"There was reason to believe Mr. Trump's campaign had knowingly violated campaign finance law."
Since Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer, was the one making the payments through his law firm, he faced a much harsher legal battle and pleaded guilty to 8 federal charges. Trump, however, was allegedly reimbursing Cohen through his enterprises and wasn't out of the legal woods yet. These sets of charges are in regards to the reimbursements made. According to the New York District Attorney, Alvin Bragg,
"The defendant, Donald J. Trump, repeatedly and fraudulently falsified New York business records to conceal criminal conduct that hid damaging information from the voting public during the 2016 presidential election."
The 34 charges are categorized in the following table. The leftmost column are entries tied to accounts payable, which utilize fraudulent invoices to cover up the misstatement. In the middle column are allegedly fraudulent voucher numbers, which tie to both accounts payable and cash disbursements, or credits made to reduce invoice balances. Finally, we have the third column, which are checks that trace to fraudulent cash disbursements made to Michael Cohen. According to the AP,
9 of those monthly checks were paid out of Trump's personal accounts, but records related to them were maintained in the Trump Organization's data system.
I want to take just a brief moment to explain the accounting behind this. I'm an auditor by trade, and it would be a shame not to draw upon my education and experience to speculate on what's going on underneath the hood. When we audit expenses, revenue, receivables, and other accounts, we use invoices as alternative methodology to vouch that certain accounting principles have been adequately realized. Invoice testing is one of a handful of procedures that we run on these accounts. Now, from an accounting perspective, the entry scheme varies from entity to entity, but typically the lifetime of an expense entry is as follows. When a service is rendered, and an expense is incurred without an issued invoice, accountants usually accrue it by debiting an expense and crediting an accrued expense, which is actually a liability, meaning they record it even when the cash hasn't been disbursed, hence the name accrued expense. A slick accountant would have first been recording the expense in that fashion, instead of just debiting the expense and crediting an accounts payable, which is still an accrual. The reason being that, 1, it's more difficult to test accrued expenses, and 2, services are commonly rendered a few days before invoices are generated, especially with legal counsel. When the invoices are generated, which typically happens before each month end, the accrued expense entry is reversed and re-entered as an accounts payable. Accounts payable are predominantly dependent upon the generation of an invoice or a receipt. Now keep in mind that the invoices are allegedly fraudulent. They serve as a smokescreen of pretend services meant to conceal the reimbursements. After the reversal, the accounting team will pay the liability at some point and truly incur an expense. This is where those checks come in, which is the final stage of the allegedly fraudulent expenses. The variation of entries that constitute a payment are diverse, but we do know that Trump is paying Michael Cohen through his personal checking account using a handwritten check. They would either reverse the expense in accounts payable entry completely and enter a debit to legal expenses and credit to cash, or leave the former entry and debit the accounts payable to offset it and credit cash. The effects on the books is the same. Now, stepping back into the audit realm, when we go to test an expense, we check the services being provided by looking at the services rendered section of the invoice, and we check the overarching contract between the business and the service provider. We also check to see if the various internal controls are being performed properly. What was allegedly happening was that Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, was in agreement with the Trump Organization and Trump himself to disguise the charge and subsequent payment as legal charges for legitimate business purposes. At this point, the probability of detection lowers dramatically. Since both entities are allegedly in cahoots, the various testing methods, mailing balance confirmations, invoice and payment testing, won't suffice. Only internal control walkthroughs will remain effective. The testing is dependent on discrepancies between the business and its vendors. When the two are jointly committing the crime, those discrepancies will be concealed on both sides of the equation. Okay, let's step away from this for a moment. We should ask ourselves the following question. Is this really a big deal? This all seems very esoteric. The answer is that it depends. White-collar crimes have a habit of being underplayed, but they greatly undermine society. In the aggregate, if gone unpunished, they destroy one of the moral pillars of capitalism, fair presentation. Regardless of what you may think about capitalism as a whole, it does require some level of adherence to certain ethical principles in order to function. Fair presentation is one of the most important because in order for the whole system to function properly, it must possess clear and honest records of activity. Especially in New York, the financial capital of the world, any egregiously fraudulent activity ought to be punished in the eyes of the prosecutors. I do want to note, however, that private companies aren't required to follow generally accepted accounting standards, or GAAP. Since private companies are held by a small number of private investors instead of being sold publicly in the stock market, GAAP isn't enforced, but encouraged for obvious reasons. They are charging Trump in relation to him triggering a false set of entries in an enterprise, though. The law, New York Penal Code Section 175.10, states,
"A person is guilty of falsifying business records in the first degree when he commits the crime of falsifying business records in the second degree and when his intent to defraud includes an intent to commit another crime or to aid or conceal the commission thereof." Falsifying business records in the first degree is a Class E felony.
In order for the first degree to stick, it relies upon the defendant being guilty in the second degree. Falsifying business records in the second degree, or Section 175.05, states,
"A person is proven guilty of said charge when, with intent to, there is evidence proving without substantial doubt he or she 1. Makes or causes a false entry in the business records of an enterprise, or 2. Alters, erases, obliterates, deletes, removes, or destroys a true entry in the business records of an enterprise, or 3. Omits to make a true entry in the business records of an enterprise in violation of a duty to do so which he knows to be imposed upon him by law or by the nature of his position, or 4. Prevents the making of a true entry or causes the omission thereof in the business records of an enterprise." Falsifying business records in the second degree is a Class A misdemeanor.
That is where the focus of the specific trial will be, on the 34 separate instances of committing Penal Code 175.10. The prosecution will focus on the intent and implications of the crime, bringing forward their evidence of wrongdoing. The defense will rely upon a couple of things: the dissemination of the charges, and evidence, of course, as well as the argument that the prosecution is pursuing these charges for corrupt reasons. This alleged corruption stems from the argument that charges were brought forward not out of justice, but rather an unjust attempt to politically hamstring President Trump. Now, it's about time that the implications specific to this trial are addressed. I wouldn't have made this series at all if I didn't think it would dramatically change the political landscape. I feel that these events will be so important that they are probably going to significantly alter the trajectory of the US, progressivism included. Heeding the call and attempting to gauge what the fallout will look like is crucial. Keep in mind that I am not a lawyer. I'll only go over the implications of verdicts specifically related to this trial. The reason why is that I believe many implications will be shared among the Georgia trial, classified documents trial, and January 6th trial, as well as the New York trial itself. Therefore, these shared implications will be covered at the end of the last video in this series. Let's begin by circling back to the prosecutorial corruption defense. It's going to play a large role in the defense's strategy and will definitely have an impact even if unsuccessful. If Donald Trump is proven not guilty, the chances of the prosecutorial corruption defense joining the list of other successful defenses might undermine the proper function of the legal, political, and business world. Just as an aside, there have been murmurs of the possibility, or rather probability, that a dedicated Trump supporter will hold out. There even might be jurors across the political spectrum who will be convinced by the content of the prosecutorial corruption defense. The use of the PC defense is pretty common in legal and quasi-legal venues such as impeachment trials. But trying to concretely predict the future or unpack a unique and untried argument surrounding prosecutorial corruption is impossible. We simply do not know what they'll bring forth, and we don't even know if the defense will rely upon it. During the recording of this video, Trump and his organization are facing a civil indictment that stems from charges that he and his employees overvalued his property by significant amounts. The defense doesn't seem to rely upon that strategy to my knowledge. It must be noted, however, that the importance of the state trial is that the defense has a movement or ideology to moor itself to. Unlike a civil trial, where the verdict is determined by the judge, members of the jury might be part of that ideology. That ideology is, of course, Trumpism, which for those who are curious, I discuss in detail in my Truth Social video. To put it kindly, Trumpism is a deeply reverential ideology. A recent CBS YouGov poll found that more Republicans trust Trump more than their family, friends, and religious leaders. If you are doubtful that the sentiment combined with the PC defense will affect this trial, as well as similar related ones, I think you're being naive. A not guilty verdict based off of the legality of the charges might serve as legal precedent and recharacterize a formerly illegal or legally ambiguous set of actions as practicable under certain circumstances. In real life, certain business owners are going to try to further intertwine themselves and their enterprises with political machinations. This is to add an additional layer of insulation against legal challenges by relying upon the successful PC defense themselves. Using political discord or clout as a defense mechanism against accusations of fraud is a tale as old as time. It has seemed to reach new heights, though, over the past few years. Owners who utilize dodgy accounting methodology or who are covering up misstatement are inclined to shore up whatever plausible and easily obtainable advantage they can get. Entry into the political world via cold hard cash has really never been simpler, so I can definitely see legally embattled business owners flocking even further to what is an ideological safe haven. On the other hand, a guilty verdict would contain specific implications that are a bit more technical. Remember, there is a myriad of implications beyond this. I'm only covering the implications specific to this case, so that I don't end up beating a dead horse. A guilty verdict will definitely spur some form of changes in auditing and accounting standards. Even though GAAP is meant for public companies, FASB, the entity in charge of producing the accounting guidelines that underlie GAAP, will take note of this peculiar case and attempt to establish or update existing guidelines. These guidelines will probably relate to the interactions of businesses and their vendors. If Trump and his associates are proven guilty, the gap within the regulatory environment, which allowed the fraudulent misstatement to occur without proper detection, will be filled. FASB has made a reputation over the past decade as one of the few government institutions ahead of the curve in terms of its regulation. It will no doubt wish to maintain that reputation, especially in a significant instance such as this. Stepping a bit back, the broader implications of this trial would serve to reinforce proper record keeping among privately held companies, especially businesses held by owners with political ambition. Even outside of the politically involved, there's going to be no shortage of dinner party conversations between these people about their apprehensions towards the verdict. Many in that position will probably discuss what they view as the government bringing down the hammer for a controversial set of financial fraud charges. To summarize, a guilty verdict might make them nervous about their own conduct and spur some level of disturbance in the financial markets. This is where I'm going to pause things for now. Later this month, the Georgia case is set to start, and I want to get the video breaking down the case, its charges, and their specific implications into your noggin. After that, expect a return to your regularly scheduled programming from your favorite pocket think tank. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you very much.